There are those who would claim that Age of Empires 3 Definitive Edition is broken, or that some of the things that have been added by Forgotten Empires are strange. I, however, would argue that the game isn't broken at all. The game is perfectly balanced, and that all of the systems are working as intended. On a completely unrelated note, today we'll be going over the Brazilian Revolution. The Brazilian Revolution is an interesting revolution because once you revolt as Brazil, all of your villagers will turn into Voluntario de Patria. These Voluntario de Patria are revolutionaries that have half as much health and attack as normal revolutionaries. However, they still take up one pop, so once you revolt, your pop will temporarily jump up to almost 300. And after the enemy culls a bunch of your Volunteer de Patria, your population will balance out to about 200 or slightly more than 200 at almost all times, because every town center will be training more of these Voluntario de Patria in batches of 9. Also, with this revolution, you can send town centers, which means you can have a number of town centers right by the enemy's base, which means that you will be constantly spawning more and more of these guys in batches of 9. On their own, they might not be worth much, but pretty soon you'll have a super swarm of these guys. They can take down almost anything, and things will rapidly escalate to the point where individual deaths become meaningless. The only real threat will be the enemy figuring out that they can stop your ruthless advance by using their artillery to take out your forts and town centers. Of course, the Italians, though they have the ability to create powerful artillery units, they aren't too much of a threat. Because I've got a hunch that the average Italian player will instead try and go for something else, like spamming pavis, or making one of their cool little skirmisher units. So they'll slowly be chewed up and spat out by your endless swarms of weak skirmisher units. On the other hand, Malta, well, they might actually be a threat. The reason why is because Malta is more of a artillery-heavy civilization. The AI has a tendency to build artillery, and I know that players aren't like that, but players are probably going to build a lot of hoop throwers, which are grenadier-like artillery units, and those guys in sufficient numbers will be able to take out your buildings. If all you're doing as Brazil is relying on your volunteers to Patria, then you're going to lose a lot of town centers. One key thing that you should probably do is send militia. The reason why is because you can send militia even if you're overpopped. That means that if a giant group of falconets and culverins are sieging down your town centers and your volunteer to Patria that are at the site aren't enough, then you can simply go ahead and send Minutemen to help enhance your numbers. The Minutemen are very cost effective because even if you don't send your conscription, a good chunk of skirmishers for only 150 food and 150 gold is a pretty good deal. And if you were fortunate enough to send the conscription card before you revolt as Brazil, then things start to get truly ridiculous. Because you can quickly go up to 300, maybe even 400 population, and have a skirmisher mass that no amount of falconets will be able to stop. The only tricky thing is that for this to really work, you have to have a bunch of town centers basically on top of your opponent. Otherwise, your militia will lose all of their HP before they can attack, and at that point you're just handing your enemy free experience, because multiplayers will have a lot of base defenses, multiplayers will have a good number of artillery type units laying around that do blast damage, so you don't want to have a swarm of units that have no HP on them. However, if you're able to sneak up a good number of town centers right next to the enemy, just at the edge of the distance that you're allowed to build away from their main town center, then you can go ahead and quickly swarm them with 100, 150, almost 200 militia, and completely break them, using a tide of human bodies to completely overwhelm the enemy. Anyways, let's take a look at the cards. First things first, we have our Cattle Drivers card, which gives you 8 semi-fattened cows, 1 jacuno, and a homestead wagon. Then the jacunos card gives you the ability to train those guys and send some. Also, you have the Gatling card, then you have the 2 ironclads, your infinite fort, the card that sends 2 town centers, the card that lets you build more villagers, the card that lets you upgrade your dragoons to independence dragoons, as well as the infinite 14 Tupi and the legendary native warriors. Your Tupi allies will be particularly useful because they don't take up any pop. So if you're already at max pop because you're volted and of course volunteer to Patria, all of your villagers turn into 2 of those guys, so you'll quickly go over 200 pop, then you can still send that card. On the off chance that you are able to build some Jacunos, then you'll notice that they don't act like normal Comancheros. Instead, They act a lot like the musket riders that you could build as the Lakota. They're pretty good units, actually. They only cost food, they only take up 1 pop each, and they do a decent amount of damage. They also have access to the cowboy economy, so they can help you gather more food and reboom, which is important because you're going to have a hard time building a whole lot of settlers since it's so easy to go over 200 pop with this revolution. So you may find yourself leaning on the cowboy economy a bit more than you normally would with other revolutions. If you can build a few of these guys, then they can actually fulfill a pretty important role within your post-revolution military because your normal units are pretty easy to blast apart with cannon fire. Whereas you can always take these bad boys, switch them into melee mode, and then set them loose on those artillery. Your crossbowmen and your volunteers of Patria, they don't do great against artillery, whereas your Nakunos with almost 400 HP, switch them into melee and watch them cut that artillery down. And the beautiful thing is that each one of those bad boys only costs 100 food in 1 pop, so even if you lose some of them to artillery, you're still coming out okay. A key thing to remember with the Brazilian Revolution is that your Volunteer de Patria are trained in batches of 9. What this means is that there's going to be a pause after you lose a good number of them, where you'll have some pop space that you can use to train some Jacunos or some Dragoons or whatever unit you need, because, as I mentioned, the Volunteer de Patria, they aren't trained in batches of 1, they aren't constantly being spit out the way that Haiti constantly spits out pirates, instead they're being trained in batches of. So it's more like you're at 199, and now you're suddenly at 208, so you will have a few seconds to train up a batch of whatever unit you need, whatever unit has been wiping out all of your Volunteer de Patria, then you can send in that unit to deal with whatever's been wiping out your Volunteer de Patria, and soon after your Volunteer de Patria will come in to take out everything else. Also, in case you're curious about the Independence Dragoons, the Independence Dragoons lose their melee bonus against other cavalry and against artillery, which most players don't even realize that Dragoon type units have that kind of bonus against enemy artillery and enemy cavalry in melee. But anyways, the Independence Dragoons lose that specific bonus against enemy artillery and cavalry in melee, but in return they gain a very powerful melee attack. What this means is that they are a much more powerful general purpose unit when it comes to melee, so you can actually use them almost as a faux lancer against enemy infantry that don't have a whole lot of HP, like say enemy skirmishers, and have them kill those in about 3 hits, since their melee attacks will now do like 35 damage. Also, their melee attacks will do plenty of damage against any citizen type units that get too close to them, so they can be used to mop up as well. The Brazilian Revolution is perfectly balanced, as all things should be.